Okay, so here we are back with Clifford Geertz again, this time looking at a piece of his ethnography rather than an explanation of his ethnographic theory. So the thing that I want to look at in this piece, aside from just getting a sense of what it is that he has to say, is how we can look at it as an example of the thick description that he described in his essay by that name last class. So he opens up Deep Play with a series of observations about the Balinese and their attitudes toward outsiders as he and his wife arrive in a village, a Balinese village, and find themselves just completely socially shut out, unable to make any meaningful contact with anyone there. Now, in this opening part, for me, frustratingly, peppers his description with phrases like, everyone ignored us in a way only the Balinese can do, or Bali, mainly because it is Bali, is a well-studied place. These things are empty phrases. They don't tell us anything about what Bali is like, what the Balinese are like. They're only meaningful, in other words, to people who already know. So in that sense, it seems from the outset that he's doing this strange thing of not writing the kind of ethnography he's just advocated for in the opening chapter of his book. So we're looking at the opening and closing essays, rather, in his book, The Interpretation of Cultures. So already we should be wondering what's going on here. He seems to be doing exactly the kind of thing that he has castigated other anthropologists for doing in thick description. But soon enough, we see that what he's doing is engaging in just some kind of storytelling. It almost feels like a bit of misdirection, like it's not the point of the piece at all. Perhaps we can think of it just as some stage setting. The cockfight, the raid, and the response the community gives to Geertz's response to the raid, that's the pivot that allows him to turn to the thing that actually is interesting to him, the meaning of the cockfight to the Balinese. So on the one hand, then, it serves the purpose of showing how he and his wife, as anthropologists, just by happenstance, gained a point of entry to the community, gained some level of connection to the community, some level of recognition from the members of the community, that they were there, that there were people who could be talked to, engaged with, that there were people at all. He phrases it in terms of solidarity, that the fact that he and his wife fled showed a kind of solidarity with the community, and that's what allowed them this kind of entree into the community. So the cockfight was the occasion for that, but then also the cockfight becomes this kind of central focus, something that allows him a particular kind of insight into the community. From the state's point of view, that is the Indonesian state, a cockfight is primitive, backward, unprogressive, all of the things that it's trying to remedy or resist or change. So for the state, it's not a point of interesting insight into a community. It's something to be suppressed. But, as he points out, this is a view from the outside. This is closer to what he would call thin description. The question for him, as an anthropologist, is what the cockfight means to the participants themselves. This is what he then wants to go on to interpret for us, his readers. So then the cockfight, he says, is as important a cultural phenomenon as any for understanding what it means to be Balinese, what being a Balinese is really like. So one of the things that he's doing here is he's pushing back against the temptation to think that the real moments of culture occur in things like important events, rites of passage, stuff like that, and that these kinds of everyday occurrences are not really where culture occurs, where you can find culture. He thinks then that the cockfight is particularly, in a sense, because of its unpretentiousness, it reveals something authentic, true, particular about the Balinese. Why? Because he says it's only apparently cocks that are fighting there. Actually, it is men. And so this is one of the themes. This is, again, him interpreting their interpretations. And so this will be a theme that occupies virtually the rest of the essay. What he means by this is that there's a deep identification between Balinese men and their cocks. And he means this with the full double entendre of both genitals and the roosters, because this kind of identification is so closely tied with ideas of masculinity. Because they are exemplary symbols of masculinity, then, when they fight, it is symbolically their owners that are engaged in the fight. Being more concise, cocks express the inversion of human status. They express animality. So he goes on at a bit of length to explain how animality in any form is not exactly taboo for the Balinese, but it's degrading. It's avoided at all cost. So that even something like eating, because it's so close to animality as they see it, is done privately. It's done sort of as quickly and invisibly as possible. It's a thing to get over and done with because there's something slightly shameful about it. Identification with the cock, then, is identification with an object of fear, right? That it's a tacit acknowledgement of one's animality, even though you try to suppress animality, you try not to express it, you try not to reveal it. So, in a sense, you could think also that it's a form of outlet for men's animality, and it's important, he points out, that it is men exclusively who engage in this, who engage in betting on it. This is not something that women in Balinese culture, I should put that in scare quotes, engage in either raising or setting to fight the cocks or betting on them. Women are not involved. He says then that this is something slightly unique in Balinese culture because otherwise both genders are involved in everything on a much more equal footing. There really isn't an arena within the society or within the village, let's say, that is exclusively male, except for this. So then we could think of it then as a particularly masculine sphere where men engage in these displays of their masculinity, but through a stand-in, the stand-in being the cock. Simultaneously then an expression of masculinity, but also an object of fear. The cockfight then has all kinds of ambivalence attached to it. It's a source of ecstasy, but it's also simultaneously a source of chagrin. So a deeply conflicted event. This is why, he says, then you get all the evasive, dissembling behavior during a match. Right? So, a kind of simultaneously a longing to engage in the battle between the cocks themselves, a desire to engage in the betting. That's where sort of the excitement comes from. But at the same time, once the battle is over, exchanging money as surreptitiously as possible, making as little of it as possible, being discreet about it, almost as if doing it without looking at one another in the eye, passing money from hand to hand without looking at one another. A kind of trying to engage in something and deny your interest in it at one and the same time. Through the section he subtitles The Fight, starting on page 8, Geertz providing thick description or thin? This, of course, is the whole purpose of this piece, is to get a look at what thick description entails. He gives a clue right at the end of that section. He says, today, the newer rectitude, he's talking about the state and state policies, the newer rectitude makes so open a statement of the connection between the excitements of collective life and those of blood sport impossible, of the cockfight. But less directly expressed, the connection remains intimate and intact. So that there's a way that the unofficial and actually illegal participation in cockfights is unsuccessfully suppressed. Why? Because the connection to the expression of masculinity, as we'll see, to expressions of kinship and community belonging, that those things persist, and they persist in a uniquely powerful way within the cockfight. We see it clearly then in gambling. He says then there are two types of gambling. There's the large central bet of even money. And these are bets that are made by the coalitions of, say, kinsfolk, or maybe if you're away at a different village, of other members of your village. And they will be the larger bets that are made between the two the individuals who have brought their cocks to do battle here. Those individuals will typically be supported financially by other members within their kin group or within larger forms of solidarity going up to the village level. But these bets are always even odds, so that both of the trainers, let's say, will put in the same amount of money, and then winner takes all. Winner also takes the carcass of the dead rooster. But the point here is that they bet the same amount of money. The second kind of bet are the bets that happen on the periphery. So if we go back to this picture here, you can see that you have the guys who have actually brought the cocks in the center of the ring, and then around the outside you have all of the people who will engage in peripheral betting. So the central large bet occurs between these two guys, and the smaller bets around the side occur among all of the onlookers who are outside the ring, so to speak. Those bets are never even odds. So they can go as high as 2-1, but they can also become quite small so that they approach even odds. So you might get 9 to 10, which is almost even but not quite. And as he points out, there are particular circumstances that drive the betting toward one end or the other. And that usually has to do with how even the match appears to be and with the size of the central bet at the outset. Okay, oh, right, and this is the last thing. So the small bets are not usually coalitional bets, so that they're not bets that are made by one person but supported by a group of, say, kinsfolk. Rather, they're just done one man to another, and that is part of the reason that they tend to be smaller. The complexity of the betting system is interesting, but it's not really what occupies us here. So to capture it in brief, he says, the higher the central bet or the large bet, the greater the effort to ensure an even match, so that for smaller central bets, it won't matter so much if the roosters are not equally paired. But when more money is at stake, then there's a much greater effort to ensure that the two cocks are roughly equal, and that the way, for example, that the expert who attaches the spurs goes about attaching them and where he attaches them will be done in such a way to even out any apparent discrepancies. So a slightly larger cock will have the spur attached at a slightly less advantageous position, and in this way the match will be as close to even as possible. So then when this happens, when the central bet is quite large, the bets around the periphery will get pushed to that end of the betting spectrum that's not even but is closer to even. So you won't get bets that are 1 to 2, but you'll get bets that are, say, 9 to 10 or 8 to 9, something like that. What's at stake with these, though, is less the money itself, except for real gambling addicts. But aside from them, it's not so much about money as it is about social prestige. So what Geertz points out is that over time, there's a likelihood that all of the central bets will even out. That you'll, especially when you're engaging in the really large bets, you're going to win and lose around equal amounts, and so you'll win and lose roughly the same amount of money either way, so that it's not really a way of generating wealth for yourself. It's more possible with the peripheral bets to make money that way. But again, the point is not to think of this as a way of generating wealth, but a way of experiencing the feeling of social prestige. So that money becomes itself symbolic. Symbolic not of economic value, but of status. And this especially with the larger wagers, as I said. So what makes these deep games are the stakes. Esteem, honor, dignity, respect, status. These are the things that are at stake, though symbolically rather than literally. So you can think back to what Weber had to say on power, right? He said that power can have an economic expression, and it can have an expression as honor or status. But these two things don't typically go one with the other. So that in this circumstance, what do we find? We find that power as wealth is subordinated to power as status, because money here is not really a vehicle for economic power. Money here and the size of the bet is a vehicle for gathering symbolic honor. So you don't get real status change through this. That's an important issue for him, that for Geertz, that is that through the cockfight, your actual social status is not going to change. If your cock loses, you don't actually lose status in your community. Similarly, you don't gain status by winning. What you gain is sort of the experience of enhanced or degraded status without actually having a change in that status. Again, the idea is that this is symbolic rather than actual status. But one other thing. So the one caveat to that is that although the cockfights do not alter actual status, it is in fact possible for people to gather wealth in the marginal bets, the bets around the periphery. Because there, if you're a shrewd bettor, or if you're a shrewd gambler, then you can in fact gather some income, some wealth. But again, and this is not something that Geertz really pays any attention to, regrettably. It would be interesting to see what he thought about this. What's not clear is whether gathering wealth will do anything to change your honor status within the society, or if it only changes your economic fortunes. It sounds as if the peripheral bets, because these are people who are not actually staking, so to speak, their own cocks in this fight, in this battle, and therefore they're not staking their own honor, their own dignity, their own status. It sounds as if what they stand to win and lose is just money, and not any actual, and that their status is not really at play in this, which again might be a further reason that the odds that you have around the outside are both smaller and never even odds, whereas where status is actually at stake, the bet is larger and even odds. Okay, so then, the fact of the matter, though, is that the symbolic staking of status is done publicly. In this sense, Geertz says, an owner and his collaborators being the ones who are supporting his wager in the cockfight. An owner and his collaborators, and also their backers on the outside, put their money where their status is. That is to say, their money goes in staking their status. It works as this symbolic representation of their status. And we can see that this is not an entirely foreign idea to us, right? That we can also get very animated about the teams that we back, and to the point that you can get these kind of absurd scenarios of people deciding that they want to get into fights in the parking lot based on the kind of sports team jersey that someone has on. They're not backing your side. So then this idea of having backers and of having something at stake in your backers, of your people, is it's not something that is really so foreign to us, even though we don't find the same kinds of events to express it. But this is it. This is this idea of publicness, the public wagering of symbolic status. That's what makes the cockfight meaningful. In the same way that for these fellows, the public symbolic expression of their affiliation with a particular team is what makes the game and their identification with their team meaningful. He says, "It is in large part because the marginal disutility of loss is so great at the higher levels of betting that to engage in such betting is to lay one's public self, elusively and metaphorically, through the medium of one's cock on the line." So again, what he's talking about here is Jeremy Bentham's assessment of betting and of wagering on thing. Bentham is not talking about cockfights, but on wagering on things like this. Why? Because Bentham is pointing out that the utility that you get, so the opportunity to increase your happiness or increase your well-being, is not great. You stand to lose more by putting your money up than you stand to gain by winning it, so that there is, in his sense, a disutility. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because Bentham was a utilitarian philosopher, and what that implies is that utilitarianism, what that implies is that we should understand morality on the basis of what brings the greatest good to the greatest number of people. So anything that deprives people of good or diminishes their happiness, those things are bad. Those are moral evils. And therefore, they should be restricted. So Bentham has an almost economic view, as if this is something that you can calculate in a more or less straightforward way. And this is how he arrives then at the idea of gambling as a kind of moral evil, something that the state should step in to outlaw. And you could see, in fact, that the Indonesian state appears to have that kind of view as well, with these ideas that it's backward, that it impairs progress, and so forth. Geertz, though, thinks that the focus on the economic in the cockfight is to miss the whole point of it. Why? Because it's not actually about economics. It's about your public presentation of self, your staking of yourself, again, through the medium of your cock. And by putting that on the line, risking that for this moment of enhanced symbolic status, but not actual enhanced status, or the risk of losing that feeling of status, that the feeling of having lost status, again, symbolically rather than actually. So that kind of staking of oneself, that's what makes the cockfight meaningful for Balinese people. So again, here we see what Geertz is interpreting is not the thin description of the economic utility of betting, but is providing a thicker description that allows us to see what's meaningful to the Balinese who engage in cockfighting, and Geertz is then interpreting that for us, the readers, so that we get this interpretation of interpretations. So then, it's those smaller bets where one's actual social position can change. Again, as I say, I take it that he means by this not status position, because it seems to be strictly economic. And it seems that those people who are betting on the periphery are not the ones who have come and, as he puts it, put their cocks on the line. It is only money that's changing hands there. So I don't see how their status is implicated in their wins and losses in the same way, but their possibility of enhancing their economic position, that is something real. In the Balinese view, though, the true cockfighter is a figure almost of reverence. while the driven gambler is a figure of derision. So this further supports the idea that it's only the true cockfighter, the one who brings and risks his cock in a cockfight, the higher the wager, the better, that's the person who sort of has this allure of esteem. Whereas the people who bet on the outside, especially the ones who are gambling addicts, that those people are not actually putting their status on the line. That's not what it's about for them. They're not the figures of mythology, even if they should win a great deal. They're not the mythological figures. It's the ones who put themselves metaphorically through the actual fighting cocks. Those are the ones who, in fact, are the mythological figures, the ones who can gain reverence. Depth in cockfighting comes from what money causes then, he says. The migration of the Balinese status hierarchy into the body of the cockfight. So that there is this way then that money is operating not as a medium of economic exchange here the way it normally does, but it's operating to transfer status to the bodies of the cocks themselves. And so then, of course, the greater the bet, the greater the amount of status transferred to the cocks, and the greater the stakes, whether your cock will win or lose. But, he says, that's not where it ends. There's more to it than that. That the cockfight is in fact a simulation of the social matrix. And in part he says that this is because the organization of cockfights amongst all of the Balinese villages follows the market system, so that where there is a market where people will go from distant villages to exchange their local goods with one another, that's also the pattern for where cockfights are staged. But his point then is to say that a man doesn't bet against a kin member's cock. So this is part of the social matrix, right? He's saying that solidarity amongst kin is solidified in the cockfight by the denial of the ability to bet on an opposing kin member's cock. To put that more clearly, that was not elegant. So to put it more clearly, if a member of your kin group is taking his cock to fight, the obligation falls on you to show solidarity with that kin member by betting on his cock to win. So then it's a way of solidifying kin allegiance. Betting and kin allegiance become tied to one another in this way. Now, but let's say your own kin group is not involved. So then there are larger levels of alliance between your kin group and another kin group. Well, okay, so then you would have to, you would be obliged by that alliance to bet for the cock put up by the member of the allied kin group against the cock of some kin group that is not allied to your own. Same thing with the village level. If somebody takes a cock to a different village or just outside of your village and it's going up against a cock from somebody else's village, your obligation is to support the one through your betting from your own village. So that you can see that within your village, you'll bet with your kin group or with your the allied kin groups within your village. Or if it's outside the village, you vote with the members of your village. So that you get these sort of concentric rings, like nested dolls of obligation and alliance and support. So then one of the effects of away games, where you're at some other village and it's a cock from your village up against a cock from another village. Those kinds allow the restoration of alliances within the village as a whole. It allows an opportunity to sort of paper over rifts that have occurred within the village, possibly within the village due to cockfights between different kin alliances, right? So that what these different scales provide is, on the one hand, the ability to show your most nuclear alliances against those around you, but on the larger scales, to allow for the mending of those rifts that occur between those groups within your village, so that you present sort of a front as a member of the same village. Okay, then the closer are the factions, the less likely their cocks will fight one another. So if there's a particularly tight alliance between two kin groups, let's say, then it is unlikely that members of those two kin groups that are allied with one another will have their cocks fight against one another. Partly because you don't want to introduce strife into your alliance. You want to maintain the alliance. Now, people who are engaged in institutionalized hostility, and he goes through some of the forms of institutionalized hostility that there can be, from bride theft and things like that. In those on occasions where there is a cock put up by somebody with whom you have this institutionalized hostility, there the cockfight is it's an occasion to express that hostility through the medium of the cockfight, so that you're not openly expressing hostility directly person to person, that it's mediated through the cockfight itself. It's a way of attacking the masculinity of the other person, but without doing it directly, right? So that in a sense, it's not an attack man to man, as it were, but rather cock to cock. And it becomes a mediated conflict rather than an open conflict between the individuals involved. Now, okay, further then, center bet coalitions have no allies, no outside money. And so with the center bet, because it's such an important expression of solidarity, you don't have investors, right? So you don't have people from the outside backing your cock in this fight. Why? Because outsiders are not members of your group. So that the coalition members are the only ones who invest, as it were, in this cock for this fight. And that means then that that's also where you can have the most naked, transparent oppositions and mediated aggression, mediated through the fight, I mean. Why? Because there it's the purest example of a clear-cut coalition against a clear-cut coalition without any other members involved. So then, money for bets is always borrowed from friends and never from enemies, and hence there are no IOUs. And this makes sense when you think about it, right? That you want to seek support from those in your coalition, and if you're a member of a coalition, you want to offer your support to those with the trainers, let's say, within your coalition, to maintain the tightness of that coalition and to present this kind of united front of us against them. But on the flip side, if you were to take money from people outside your coalition, then you expose yourself to being in debt to your enemies. And that's the last thing that you want. That's the surest way to imperil your status. So then in fights that are neutral for you, so you don't have a stake in it one way or another in terms of your kinship allegiances, your village allegiances, or anything like that. It's just you're a peripheral bettor, and you don't know the people involved in the fight. Well, then in that case, the only thing that really matters is that you don't bet against one of your friends. So then people can go to great pains to avoid knowing how your friends and relatives are betting, so that you can bet the way that you want to bet on any particular fight. But if you know, and if others know that you know, then the imperative on you is that you vote in the same way that they did, or just don't bet at all. So then again, those involved in the center bet are typically leading members of their group. It makes sense, once more, right, that whoever is the leader of the group in real terms also has to be the leader of the group in symbolic terms by putting up the money to support the cock that is symbolically your group. And so this is why then the leaders, in actual fact, have also to be the leaders symbolically with the cockfights. Prestige then comes from defeating the opponent's cock rather than from winning money. As I said before, Geertz's point is that over the long haul, the amount of money that you win and lose more or less evens out. So the point is to get that momentary feeling of elevation and status from your cock defeating the opponent's cock. Betting with kin then reinforces the social relations around your group and allows you a certain sort of portion of the pleasure of feeling your group prevailing through the mediation of the cock over some opposing group. The rivalries and hostilities activated in cockfighting are in play form then, so that you don't get actual violent disputes between the members of alliances. You get this kind of play of hostilities through the cocks, so that they can always seem to sort of teeter on the cusp of open, serious aggression because so much is at stake, but they're always mediated through this other form. Of course, as Geertz points out, it's not just play for the cocks themselves. One of them's going to die, often both. At very least, you're gonna wind up with a winner who's probably still injured. To get a sense of the seriousness of the injuries that are possible, just maybe in November or December of 2020, in the Philippines, the police raided a cockfight, and one of the cocks, the spur from one of the cocks, slashed the thigh of a police officer who had picked up the cock, and slashed it so deeply that it nicked the artery that runs through your thigh, and the officer bled to death from that. So again, this is for the cocks and for the raiding police officers, deadly serious stuff. But it's only play for the Balinese who are putting up the cocks. Serious play, deadly serious play, but ultimately just play. What deep play, the essay then, offers us is first Geertz's explanation of how he found his feet, to take that quotation that he offered in the previous piece, Thick Description. So how it is that he found his feet among the Balinese, this moment of the raid where he runs away with all the other Balinese, and then he engages in this bit of theater with a Balinese couple pretending that they had just been chatting there in the courtyard of this Balinese individual for hours, because they're anthropologists, of course, and they're here to learn about Balinese culture, and so that's what we've been doing, etc., etc. Engaging in that bit of theater, showing solidarity with them. This is the first moment of finding his feet among the Balinese. And then as he goes on to learn more and more about the cockfight, among other things, kinship, the management of water resources, and a whole bunch of other things, that these are the ways, practically, that he finds his feet among them. This is the way that he is able to, as he puts it, carry on a conversation with them. A conversation meaning not just that they have words in common that they can exchange, but that they share criteria for the things that they're discussing. A conversation in that sense. So then cockfights were one way of achieving this. Throughout the piece then, we can see Geertz providing a thick description to the reader so that the reader can, through this essay, attain a clearer, deeper sense of Balinese cockfights and, by extension, of the Balinese themselves. And he does this by interpreting the Balinese interpretations. Again, interpretations of interpretations, as Weber made the point. He says, the culture of a people is an ensemble of texts, themselves ensembles, which the anthropologist strains to read over the shoulders of those to whom they properly belong. So this is an important innovation in anthropology in the 70s and 80s, and it was an innovation that made Geertz arguably the most important anthropologist, certainly the most important American anthropologist, for 2 or 3 decades. This idea of thinking of cultures as texts, of things that we can read, but that the texts that we're reading are themselves ensembles of interpretations generated by the people who the anthropologist wishes to describe and understand and explain. So then the work of the anthropologist in this sense is, as he puts it, to read over the shoulders of those to whom the texts properly belong as a way of learning how the participants or the members of a given community interpret those texts themselves, what they take them to mean, and through that, the anthropologist gains an understanding or the ability to provide an interpretation of his or her own. He concludes then, societies, like lives, contain their own interpretations. One has only to learn how to gain access to them. And this, of course, is what he thinks the work of the anthropologist should be, and why he thinks that this work should be done as interpretation. Now, there's one thing that I think is important. It's worth noting here. There's absolutely no question that Freud is in the background of this entire book. So then Freud, in 1899, published The Interpretation of Dreams. And it was an absolute breakthrough in psychology at the time. It was the first piece to take dreams as psychoanalytically or psychologically relevant at all. And it was the first, by extension, to extend the interpretation of dreams into an entire science of the understanding of the human psyche. The psyche made up, in Freud's view, predominantly of the unconscious. That part of our psychic reality, psychic not in the sense of palm readers, but psychic in the sense of the psyche. So Freud thought then that the majority of our psychic lives occurred unconsciously, and that the way that we would gain access to it was not directly. We would have no direct access to it, but we would have access to it through our dreams. And the work of the psychoanalyst then, Freud presenting himself as the paradigm example of the psychoanalyst, was that the patient, or what he would call the analysand, would recount the dream, but the analyst would understand that the recounting of the dream was itself already an interpretation of the dream. It's what he called secondary revision. So that the way that we reconstruct a dream is not how the dream actually occurs when we're asleep, because we're unconscious at the time, but rather it's the way that we consciously reconstitute the dream, giving it, say, a narrative structure that it wouldn't naturally have, but that we provide it. And then the work of the psychoanalyst is to interpret that interpretation. So again, that has a very familiar ring to it. Now, it's curious that the title of Geertz's book, Interpretation of Cultures, so closely matches the interpretation of dreams. And yet, Freud doesn't get cited anywhere in here, right? We saw he mentions Freud, but he doesn't actually provide a citation of Freud. So that's a curious thing. It seems like it might be a kind of evasiveness on Geertz's part. Why? Because it suggests that he's thinking of the interpretation of cultures, his book, as having the same kind of importance for anthropology that the interpretation of dreams had for psychoanalysis. In that, it was to provide a key to a whole field of study, a method for a whole field of study, just as the interpretation of dreams did. Because arguably, psychoanalysis only came into existence with Freud, and really only came into existence with the studies that Freud did that led to the interpretation of dreams. So then it's very curious that Geertz simply doesn't mention that. But it seems like he might be thinking of these books as having the same kind of status, that is, as volumes that are definitive for their fields. And he was not wrong for a period, that indeed the interpretive method or interpretive anthropology did become the dominant way of approaching anthropology, how it would be done, what you would look for, and what the anthropologist was doing for, as I said, for quite a long time, from the 60s and 70s into at least the 90s. And so his desire for his book to have that kind of stature is not entirely misguided, even though it is implicit and even kind of suppressed, that desire throughout his book. Now, one thing that's curious, though, and that's different from Freud, is that whereas Freud would, in the interpretation of dreams and of the volumes of writing that he did afterward as a psychoanalyst, that work would always be very attentive to the words that the analysand, or the patient, actually spoke. So something that might strike you as strange, if your antennae were attuned to this, is that Geertz actually doesn't quote any Balinese people saying anything at all throughout the entire essay. He reports some speech, but even that, it's reported sort of as a means to explaining how it is that he got access to the Balinese community that he's in, to the villagers. He doesn't actually quote anybody who talks about cockfights. He doesn't quote anybody who talks about betting or anything like that. So there's a certain kind of curiosity. Geertz is very happy to quote Aristotle or Auden or a number of other academic figures and poets as ways of showing his erudition, and yet he doesn't quote the Balinese villagers who he says that he's interpreting. So it's very curious. So one thing that I would like to leave as a question then is whether this weakens his ethnography. Do we feel then that he's given us a solid interpretation of the Balinese cockfight as it's interpreted by Balinese? I would say yes. I would say that we wind up with a fairly good sense of just how elaborate it is and just how meaningful it is to the people involved. Would it be stronger still if he had, in fact, quoted any of the people with whom he interacted in this village? I think it might. I think it might actually really deepen the analysis to know exactly what people said about the thing that Geertz is interpreting. To sum up then, the objective is construal of construals, as he puts it, so that the anthropologist construes what the Balinese people construe. Explications of explications, so that the anthropologist is explaining what the Balinese people have explained. Interpretations of interpretations, to go all the way back to Weber. And that this then is what thick description is all about, and what this piece was supposed to be an example of. Thank you.